created a video about Star Wars versus Star Trek, and I've took in consideration many different data tables that we see online, and some of the ones I wanted to let you know that I've used to have influenced a lot of the data is torpedoes in Star Trek are capable of doing around 65,000 megatons of damage, and the Type X phaser seen on a Galaxy-class starship also does 65,000 terawatts of damage. So most of my calculations are based upon these two weapons for Star Trek, based on actual physics seen on the show if they were brought into the real world. So then I did the same thing with Star Wars, so we have a constant. So in Star Wars, the weapon systems are a little more different. We have heavy turbo lasers seen on Imperial class Star Destroyer, who can do 6,700 terawatts of damage. And then there's the heavy Turbolaser Turrets, which would be able to do 30,000 terawatts of damage. And then a standard turbo laser, which is 3,750 terawatts of damage. Anti-ship laser cannons would be around 1,000 terawatts of damage. And laser cannons on fighters like the TIE Fighter and X-Wing do around 500 terawatts of damage. These are based mostly from the movie. There's a scene where they destroy asteroids, and the Imperial class Star Destroyer is showing different levels of energy output, and so these are being calculated for the different weapons aboard the vessel. Another data table that I took in consideration is SPD ranks seen in some of the Star Wars ships, but only SPD ranks don't really mean anything until we find a constant. So by analyzing how much ship damage and what we already know, we found that 1 SPD equals 126 terawatts. So for example, an Imperial class Star Destroyer has a shield that should be around 640 SPDs, so that would come out to 806,400 terawatts. It also has a ray shield, which would be 200 megatons, and ray shields and energy shields in Star Wars operate differently than in Star Trek. The energy shield will stop energy blasts, so it has around 800,000 terawatts of damage it can take from energy weapons, and physical weapons like torpedoes, missiles, it has a 200 megaton capability. And the reason we know this is the Venator is basically half of what an Imperial class Star Destroyer is, and we get these statistics from Clone Wars. Now the next thing we have to take in consideration is where a lot of our data is coming from. Obviously if it's coming from the movies, the series, but we're also taking a look at the manuals. So on Star Trek side, I've used the Star Trek Encyclopedia, Star Trek DS9, obviously the movies, DS9 the show, TNG, and the original Star Trek movies. Now with Star Wars, I have the movies, Clone Wars, and Star Wars Rebels. I also have Star Wars, The Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, Star Wars Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology, and then Star Wars, The Complete Vehicle Guide. I've used these as well. And then Star Trek Shipyards for some of the data as well. Some of the things we're not using is we're limiting the amount of information coming from games. Anything that's in any of the manuals will override anything seen in a video game or a novel. And we'll be using nothing from J.J. Abrams, Star Trek, or Star Wars. And the reason for that is those movies don't follow the lore very well from the past, and they seem to do things and they don't seem to make a lot of sense in the actual Star Wars and Star Trek universes. So I won't be using, or if I use any of their information, it'll be very limited. So the next thing is we need to combine the Star Wars universe with the Star Trek universe. The Star Trek universe is much smaller than the Star Wars galaxy, so what we're going to do is we're going to bring down the Star Wars, or Star Trek universe, and then place it inside of Star Wars, and it'll look something like this. So we're going to have the Cardassian Union, and just the free space will be in that dead area space where nobody knows where anything is, because there's no jump gates or there's no portals to those areas. In Star Trek and Star Wars, they operate very differently. Star Trek uses warp bubbles and moves in real time, as in Star Wars uses light speed and hyperspace. In hyperspace, you have to have these tunnels, pathways, in order to follow them to get to wherever you're going. And making or finding these pathways is extremely hard and dangerous. So they have really done nothing out in this space. So it is feasible that this Star Trek, Star universes could be together and never known about each other, because the galaxy of Star Wars is too far away for Star Trek to get to, and there's no subspace portal taking you to the Star Trek universe, so they would never have come in contact. So when a ship goes into hyperspace, it doesn't move like ships in Star Trek. And I know J.J. Abrams films show this, and they are absolutely wrong, and that's why the main reasons why I'm not using them. And then on the Star Trek side, they seem to be using turbo lasers half the time instead of phasers and torpedoes like they should be. So that's why I completely disregard those new movies, because they just don't make a lot of sense to me. So this is how it's going to start out. We're going to end up having one Imperial patrol ship is going to discover a hyperlane, which is going to lead to our Star Trek universe. And I hope you guys enjoy. So one of the things to take into consideration is the size of the Empire versus the Star Trek universe. In the Star Wars universe, the Empire consists of 1,500,000 planets, 69,000 colonies, and has 1,000 sector fleets. Each sector fleet consists of 2,400 ships, typically consisting of 24 Imperial-class Star Destroyers and 2,400 support vessels. Altogether, the Empire has 24,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, around 2,000 Dreadnought Imperial-class Star Destroyers, and around 12 Dreadnought-class Clone Wars era vessels, and 2,400,000 Dreadnoughts, small cruisers, and things of that nature. And then their most powerful ships are the Super Star Destroyers, which are seen on top here, and altogether there are 30 of these vessels. The standard Super Star Destroyer that we're used to seeing, there are 12 of those, and then there are a bunch of other Super Star Destroyers that were built, which are around the Clone era, as well as some other variants that exist. And to the left side of the screen, you'll see a comparison of the Imperial class Star Destroyer and the Galaxy class starship. Also, all these ships are relatively correct sizes, except for obviously the Imperial class Super Star Destroyer. Next, we'll need to look at the other major races that exist in the Star Trek universe besides the Federation. One of the most powerful, or the most powerful, would be the Dominion. Now, we don't know the exact size of the Dominion, but we know for sure that when the Dominion was trapped in the Alpha Quadrant, they had approximately 1,405 heavy cruisers, as well as 17,451 attack fighters, and they had 30 dreadnoughts, and they had 4 of the larger dreadnoughts that are 4,800 meters. The Ferengi have a relatively small army of around 205 Marauder class starships. The Bree Empire has around 6,200 cruisers, and the Cardassian Union mostly consists of Galar class starships. There are 485 Type 1s, there are 844 Type 2s, and there's around 404 Type 3s, which is their most advanced version of the Galor. Is around also 404 Kelton class advanced Newer Age vessels, as well as Hidikis. There are around 1,200 Hidiki class starships, and there are also around 1,200 dreadnoughts, which are unmanned attack drones, and this is based off data given in the DS9 manual. The Cardassians probably also have a few thousand other ships of old era class, but not very many. Most of those ships were deconstructed after the Federation border wars and were brought down to rebuild Galor classes. The next race we take a look at is the Romulan Star Empire. We really don't know much about the Romulan Star Empire's military. except for we know that they had around 500 Derridex class warbirds and around 2,500,000 Romulan scouts. And we know of at least during this time period 12 Velron class warbirds, or Valdile. And then we'll take a look at the Klingon Empire. The Klingon Empire had about 8 Nigvars, and the majority of their large capital ships comes from the Volca class cruisers, which are around 459, and they had the Katanga at 823, as well as 100 Cavort large bird of preys, and the vast majority of their empire consists of Barrel class vessels or other variants of birds of prey, about 5,830. So obviously, comparing these races, none of these races can boast the amounts of military force that the Empire can. Next, we'll take a look at the second most powerful empire in the Star Trek universe, which would be the Federation. The Federation boasts around 30,000 starships. It's by far the largest empire seen in the Star Trek universe besides the Dominion. We'll take a look at the composition of their fleet. A vast majority of their fleet, though, is not. It's mostly shuttlecrafts and vessels of that nature. Actually, defensively, they have about 499 large capital ships. About 200 of them consist of Galaxy-class and Nebulas, another 50 with Intrepids, around another 200 or so with the Akiras, actually 191, and then around 58 Ambassador classes. These vessels have shields of around 1,755,000, and then their majority of their fleet comes from middle-class starships. So as you can see, middle-class starships, our shields are around 1,040,000. So that would be ships like the Norway class, the Saber, and Steam Runner. So as you can see that the Steam Runner is around 240, the Saber is the largest amount at 724, and the Norway around 299. And the only reason we see so many of those ships compared to the others is after the Borg, they started building smaller medium-class ships instead of larger ships. But since in the storyline the Dominion War did not happen, the full fleets you see here, which were lost, will exist. So we'll have like the Challenger, there's 42, the New Orleans class is around 451, and also there's a lot of Maquis Raiders, with around 480 existing in Starfleet around this time. But on the other hand, Starfleet also has a lot of really old ships, and these would be ships that had shields around 390,000 from the Star Trek movie era. So the Excelsior is 515, and then you would see 820 Mirandas, probably around 50 Constitutions, only 9 Constellations, and probably around 400 Curries and 403 Centaurs. Now, you do see the ambassadors in all three categories, and that's because the ships existed and were built in all three categories. The same thing happened with the Excelsior. The Excelsiors could have shields of 390, or they could have shields of 1,040,000, but pretty much most of the ships that you're going to see, or that we see in Deep Space Nine, only had shields of 390, which at the time was the most advanced shielding in that time period. So the Miranda, the Constitution, and the Excelsior had those. And also during that time period, around 2,186 ships or orbers. So when you look at the Federation fleet, a vast majority of actually ships that are capable of fighting, there's around 4,383. Half of that force is old class starships. And that's something that you need to take in consideration, is the Federation's 30,000 mark ships is consisting of, 2,000 plus old ships, and then the vast majority are runabouts and colony ships and ships of that nature that are not capable of defending themselves. Another variable is the size of ships. When you compare ships in the Star Trek and Star Wars universe, I have put a few small ships that are in the Star Wars universe and shown you some of the larger ships that we see in the Star Trek universe. So as you can see, in Star Wars, the most common ship in the Empire is the old Dreadnought classes, which have existed for thousands of years, as well as the Nebulon Bs. There are a lot of them as well, and can go to show you that one Dreadnought is the size of the Galaxy class or any of the other major Empire ships. So they are able to hold huge amounts of crew on board their starships. And another thing to take in consideration is how they fight. In the Star Trek universe, there's next to no vehicles existing at this time period. Starfleet, Romulans, and Klingons all had hover tanks during the Enterprise era, but due to ships being able to fire from orbit and advancements in weaponry and the ability to lock on from orbit and take out enemies with pinpoint range and accuracy, there's no use for ground vehicles anymore in the Star Trek universe. So they have a huge disadvantage when it comes to that. So they mostly just fight ground forces. They transport their troops to where they need to go, or they're dropped off in shuttlecrafts if they're not able to use their transporter. And that's another thing that needs to be taken in consideration, is the Empire is the exact opposite. Alright, so now let's take a look at the exact opposite spectrum, the Empire. So when the Empire plans on engaging or taking over a planet, they'll typically send one Imperial class Star Destroyer. Imperial class Star Destroyer can have up to 72 fighters. It'll have one mobile base, 8 shuttles, as well as 20 AT-ATs and 30 AT-STs. They'll carry approximately 9,700 troops, 8 transport ships capable of transporting the AT-ATs, as well as 15 troop transports. It's also noted that the mobile base carries a lot of smaller vehicles within it as well, such as the speeder bikes and stuff, so there are several hundred of small vehicles located in there as well. So when it comes to materials, the Empire carries a lot of power and force for planetary conquering within each vehicle. Now, the Victory class and some of the other ships do carry payloads of ground forces as well, just nowhere near as high as the Imperial class Star Destroyers do. The only exception would probably be the Akumar cruiser, which is the old Clone Wars cruiser, which can land in planetary surface and drop off its payload of vehicles. The other thing is the Imperial class Star Destroyers can enter atmosphere, and a lot of Star Trek ships can't. I mean, there are some that can, like the Warbird Voyager, and some of those others can enter atmosphere no problem, but mostly Star Wars ships have no problem going in and out of atmosphere.